Actually, I was in France. It was summer. We were at the beach, and I got a call from Egon Zehnder, which is one of those headhunting companies. So I picked up, and the guy tells me, listen, I have this very cool job. That might be something for you. And I said, what is it? And so he says, CEO of NZZ. And I tell him, but you're totally crazy. You're totally nuts. I mean, I've been working for the last 7 years in energy. I'm totally gone.
In this episode, I'm talking with Felix Graf, the CEO of NZZ, who studied chemistry and physics at the ETH Zurich. This is the We Are ETH podcast, and I am Susan Kish, the host. Felix, how did you end up at the ETH? Because from what I've read, you actually were thinking about being a musician. How did that twist or change in that road happen? Tell us that story.
Actually, during my high school years, I had just one hobby. I was playing music every single day, 4 hours or so. And
what did you play?
The saxophone. And when I was 17, I got to Boston and went to visit Berkeley, and I just loved it. And then so the question was...
The Berkeley School is fantastic.
Yeah. And so I came home to my parents and I said, listen, I'm going there. And that was the only time in my entire life where my father said, listen, this might not be the best idea that you ever had. Music is a wonderful hobby, but to live from it is a tough call.
Which is correct, but still, it must have been so hard.
And to be very frank, there was a second dimension to it, and that I realized also in Boston. I was a decent saxophone player, but there are some kids on the block that play so much better. And it's such an international world, and saxophone in particular. There's so many saxophone players that I had to realize, gosh, I'm never going to be good enough in order to move beyond becoming a teacher in a high school or anything. And at least that was the assessment at the time. And that brought me then to something that I was also interested in. And so that was physics. And
okay, talk to me about this. How do you go from physics to jazz, right? I think of jazz and I think of great jazz and I think of improvisation, right? But I think of physics and I think of a very different sort of mindset approach. But then I never really understood physics.
I wouldn't agree. I think physics, and if you look at the great physicists, not that I ever was one of them, but if you look at the great physicists, their world and their imagination was a very special one. They were wondering about the world and rethinking the world. There's a lovely book by Alan Lightman that's called Einstein's Dreams. And he describes how Einstein, back in this Annus Memorabilis, where he had 3 groundbreaking papers, is sitting it's fictional, but still it tells you a bit about it. Sits there in the burn and falls asleep and starts to dream about certain worlds. And so it describes how the special theory of relativity could have developed and his understanding of time. And then, of course, you have some methodological things that are usually a language of mathematics that you need to translate.
Oh, that's great. So your father gave you the big nudge to say, he may want to give this another thought. And you went and you studied chemistry and physics at the ETH. Did you continue to play music while you were there?
Yeah, that's how I earned my money during those years. Yeah, I played in different bands. I didn't play as much as I used to. I used to play 4 to 5 hours a day. But then, of course, that was not possible anymore. But I continued to play.
Interesting. So you go to the ETH, you finish the program, and then what?
My plan was to go to MIT for my PhD. And it was all set up. I already had a professor chosen to go to. And then my father died. And I had a small brother. He was 12 years old. I was 25 at the time. And my mother was home. And so I felt I couldn't leave them behind. And so I decided to stay at ETH to do my PhD. Not that ETH is not an excellent school to do a PhD at, but I wanted to move. And so since actually American way of teaching always appealed to me, and MIT is an excellent school, and that was my initial thought. And then I stayed in Zurich and I did my PhD in quantum optics.
Quantum optics, what does that mean? Or what does that entail?
think about quantum mechanics in general, but in optical systems. What I did, I studied fluorescence processes in different materials. I had a laser, I had my lab. I cooled down my materials to minus 271 degrees Celsius.
Oh my gosh.
And at the time, we actually had the largest optical data storage of the world, but we also really did fundamental physics. And that was the big time where both the Einstein condensation and all those things were happening. And so my intent was actually to become a professor, to become an academic. Yeah. The Institute had a couple of Nobel laureates too.
Okay. That's inspiring.
So cool people that I was working with. And I was really a scientist. I was a pure scientist. I didn't know anything about business, about economics. And so that was a very clear track. What I realized doing my PhD was that my perspective was always getting a bit narrower. So if you study physics initially, you stand on the shoulders of all those giants and you learn all those things. And then when you start to generate, your field becomes narrower because you generate yourself. And I started to realize that what I was working in is of no interest for anybody. Or at least there were about 5 people in the world that were still interested in what I was doing. And my mother didn't understand what I was doing. My grandmother didn't understand what I was doing. Nobody was understanding what I was doing. And actually, the typical reaction was the one that you gave me before. Oh, physics, that's the one topic I never understood. And so,
sorry to be so predictable.
Yeah. So very, very normal reaction. And so I decided to actually then at that stage to change field. And there would have been 2 options. One was to go into industries and either do math for a company like Swiss Re or something similar, so kind of skill that would be needed, or to do something totally different. And I went for the totally different.
All right. So you've got your PhD and you've decided to go another path of completely different. What did you choose?
To be frank, I felt like I wasn't going to get a Nobel Prize. And I also realized that to be able to study or to be a professor at a university like ETH or MIT or Caltech or Harvard is wonderful. But to go to Fredericton, somewhere in Canada, and to be a professor there didn't appeal to me.
So there aren't that many professorships. So you have to go where they are.
So it's very narrow. It's very similar to music again. It's a very international field. And you need to also be lucky in order to get one of those roles. And you need to be bloody good. I had a postdoc position at MIT after my PhD that they had offered me. And my wife and I, she's a molecular biologist and was doing her PhD, and we got our daughter back in 1998. So when I finished my PhD, she was just born. So we could have moved to Boston on $30,000 US, probably just being able to work and so on. And with this perspective onto the world, I said, okay, let's try something totally new. And it wasn't very clear to me what to do. The one thing I knew, I didn't want to go into an industry lab. That felt like boring. Either you do science and you do proper science in university environment, or you don't. And therefore, I decided, okay, let's really do something totally different. And I had no clue what I was doing, to be frank. And I said, okay, let's go into a company where I can learn all the stuff I have no clue about. So I decided to go into management consulting.
I was about to say, that sounds like management. So did you go to McKinsey or BCG?
Okay. So I interviewed with a couple of them. I didn't know them all. I knew one, and that was McKinsey, and that was the one that I really didn't want to go to. I was very absolute in my thinking at the time. I had an offer from Bain, I had an offer from BCG, and then we were at my wife's supervisor's dinner over Christmas, and his wife worked for McKinsey. And we talked it over, and I said, I don't know whether I should go to BCG or to Bain. They seem to be fun both, but I have actually no clue. And she said, why don't you interview with McKinsey? And I said, no, I would never work for McKinsey.
It's pretty clear. Not to be insulting or anything, but I would never work for your firm.
Exactly. And I used some words that I'm not going to use here on the podcast. And then she said, okay, this sounds all very absolute. Why don't you build yourself your own perspective by at least talking to them? So I did, and that's where I ended up.
Life moves in mysterious ways. So
Totally.
then you go and you learn about 25 different industries and lots of frame of reference. How was your time at McKinsey?
It was tough in many ways because there are all those CEOs and chairmen and successful entrepreneurs that they can live on 3 hours sleep. I can't. I need to sleep 6 hours. So it was
You
tough.
are human. That's good. It's a good thing.
So it was tough because we used to work really a lot, late into the night and much abroad in different industries as you described it. And so also a small child, it was difficult on my wife. It was difficult on our family. I was gone the entire week and just came back on weekends. And usually I was so bloody tired on the weekend that I wasn't of great help. So those were not easy years, but I loved it. I learned so much. I got into stuff, and actually, probably, but one of the nicest things I heard, the brand CEO of a large company at one stage said to the partner, so to my boss, said to her, "Listen, he must be a brand expert." And
And you're going like, I just figured this out last week.
I was new in the field, so it was really interesting. I loved it. I learned a lot.
So how did someone persuade you to leave McKinsey?
That was always clear to me. I kind of like to be responsible for something, and in which role that ever is. And in consulting, if you're honest to yourself, you're never responsible. You
pass over the deck and you tell them to do it.
Exactly. And you act at the board level, at the CEO level, you feel as a young guy or a young woman as at par, but you're not, because you're just a consultant, so to say. And so that's one side. And the other side is in a company, in a strategy management consulting company as McKinsey, and particularly in a world that with these companies that, I mean, my daily rate was €7,000, something like that. So it's not that I got that much money, but that's what our clients were charged for. You can only stay for a limited time because it's so bloody expensive for these companies. And so I was very close to my clients and wanted to spend time with them. So I felt from the beginning on that I would want to actually remain with the client. That was very early on that I understood that. And my family and I, we then moved from Switzerland to the Netherlands. That's when my second son was born. Our original plan was to go to India, but then my wife got toxoplasmosis. So that's, yeah. And so we didn't know whether my son would be healthy or not. And so we decided we would still go abroad, but closer to home, with hospitals and all the things, and also with family. And so we went to the Netherlands. It's really a wonderful spot. Really, honestly, loved it there. Also loved the attitude of working, which is much more pragmatic than Swiss or Germans. And McKinsey, we had this saying, if you went home at 10 o'clock, the comment was, "Oh, you're taking half the day off." And Amsterdam was much more relaxed. A partner would actually come on Monday morning only at 10 o'clock because he had to bring his children to kindergarten before. That would have been unthinkable in those years in Switzerland. Unthinkable. So it was a much more pragmatic, more fun experience than in Switzerland. But still, we discussed, should we move back? And we decided to move back also for my wife and family and also for her professional development. And so we went back. And that was also the stage where I decided, okay, I'm moving out.
Got it. Which client was lucky enough to get their engagement manager to stay with them?
It was Swisscom then, and it was actually fun. I got back and I had a project with Swisscom, and we lived close to Zurich on Langstrasse or off Langstrasse. And I took the tram from the main train station to Langstrasse with my two kids on both sides, and the former client was in the tram. And so I was on a sabbatical at that stage, and he said, "Oh, you're back. I hadn't seen you." And so we chatted. He went towards Bluewind Tower at the time. And I said, "Yeah, I'm back." And he said, "Okay, what are you doing?" And I said, "I don't really know." He said, "I have a job. I want to join." So it happened in a tram. So very tough thing, planning.
Very cool. Serendipity rules.
A total serendipity rule. So I took that job and I became, at the time, head of strategy within the wireline department of Swisscom.
And those were great years. This is the early 2000s?
That's the early 2000s. And what was really cool, I worked there for about 1.5, 2 years. And then we had a huge strategy project because what was very clear is that in Switzerland, we had a very dense cable infrastructure. And these guys were starting to offer voice over IP. So they were cannibalizing the business of the telco, but telcos were not able to do anything beyond broadband. And so the big question was, how can we move into TV? And we set up a huge strategy project and defined how we would invest into broadband infrastructure, and then we would build up a TV service. So I took over that project, and it was with about 1,000 people with enormous amounts of building up broadband services, broadband access infrastructure, but also TV services. And we launched a TV service then back in 2005. And so I became operationally responsible for TV and entertainment business of Swisscom. And it was a huge challenge because at the time on these copper cables, things didn't work out.
This is before fiber optic or sort of as the transition to fiber optic?
That's the transition to fiber optic. You can always say you bring the fiber closer to home. And there we brought the fiber to a distance of about 1,500 meters. And so the technology is called VDSL. So it's not ADSL, it's VDSL that we deployed at the time. But it was not stable. The TV platform wasn't stable. We launched IPTV with Microsoft at the time. It was a nightmare. I was all the time in Silicon Valley with Microsoft. I remember this thing. One of the big other clients of Microsoft was AT&T. And so I went over, I met up with all those managers, and we discussed service. And the big thing in Switzerland already then was to save energy. So people would switch off their set-top boxes. And if you would switch the set-top box on again, that would take 4.5 minutes. And that was a nightmare. So I discussed that with the AT&T guys, and I tried to convince Microsoft that this was no way to continue. We had to reduce that time. And the Americans just said, why? What's the problem? And until to the point where I recognized that it didn't even occur to them to switch off the setup box. They were just talking about switching off the channel.
Oh, interesting. So just the sort of the cultural habits that are so ingrained.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
In Switzerland, people would switch off their broadband modems and they would switch off their setup box. In the US, they wouldn't even think about it. They would leave the car running for half an hour in front of their house just to warm up the bloody thing.
Make sure the thing was warm when you walked in. It's freezing out there.
Exactly. So these cultural differences were really interesting. And also the AT&T guys, they were always hunting for the next new cool feature. And we were just hunting for stability. Oh, we shouldn't have so many freezes. We shouldn't have so many dropouts, blah, 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 blah. They didn't care. Just let's introduce a new feature. And it was really interesting.
At that time, none of the U.S. telcos were really made that transition you guys did to TVs, right? AT&T was... They tried.
They really failed.
They really failed.
They really failed. And they really failed because of this attitude also to some extent. Because TV is a business that needs to work. People won't switch on the thing and then it needs to work. Yes, you can have some cool services, but still it needs to work. I really got my gray hairs starting then, but it was a cool moment. I had a cool team working with me. And we started as it was really an entrepreneurial work. The CEO gave me the mandate to launch that. And we started from zero. And we went through hell to make it run. And once we had about 300,000 customers, I decided, okay, now it's about time for the next stage. It was also at that stage that they started to integrate product into the standard customer processes, which was necessary, which was also absolutely reasonable. But I lost a lot of the entrepreneurial capability to working on that. At that stage, I said, okay, let's move out. Let's look for something else. Then I moved over.
Got on the tram with your kids again.
Yeah. Actually, one of the guys that had worked with me in this transition was a very successful entrepreneur, and Swisscom bought part of his company. And he was in pay TV and in cinemas. And we became friends, and he was at a certain age. Actually, I thought he was at a certain age. He was 50 by then. which now looking back, I would say he was still very young.
Funny how perspective changes.
Totally, totally. He then asked me whether I would want to be his successor. It was a company a bit like Sky, so on premium content or HBO, and it was called Teleclub, so the Swiss version of Sky, and it didn't work out. He threw me out after half a year. And that was a very interesting experience. It didn't work out for him, but he also sensed that it didn't work out for me. I was a tech person, and there it was about buying content, and buying content I was not really interested in. Buying some Disney content, buying some HBO content or so. I was a tech person. This moment of being thrown out of a company was a total setback. I had 2 small children, and I felt, okay, I need to earn money. And I got thrown out of the company, and I don't know whether I find a new job or so. That almost killed me at the time. And the guy, we're still friends, which I think is a great thing that we achieved that, or that we've been able to keep this friendship. He also told me, listen, it doesn't work out for different reasons. I pay you your salary for another 1.5 years if you're in trouble or so on. But still, this sensation of defining myself through my profession has been a very strong feeling for all those years. And so I felt totally useless. And looking back...
And especially in Zurich, where when those things happen, those people often, after that experience, people often just disappear.
That's true. And I think this very healthy, good attitude of America, in many ways, America has many downsides too, the United States, but it has the positivity on many things. And failing is...
And resilience.
And resilience. And that's something I think that defines this nation to a large extent. And in Switzerland, if you fail, you're a failure. In the US, if you fail, it's great.
You learn something.
It's great because you learn something, and most likely you won't fail the same way the second time.
That's right. You'll figure out another way, but that's right.
Yeah, I had a very great friend, my former boss at Swisscom. I called him, and he said, listen, I'm going out bicycling. I'll write you by tomorrow morning with some suggestions of what you could do. And next day he sent me 2 pages of suggestions what I could do.
This is a good friend.
Yeah. So then I had a coach, and I went hiking with that coach an entire day. I was thinking about what is the next big thing that I would want to do. And so the guy told me, think about what you would have wanted to be written on your tomb.
On your tombstone.
Yeah, on your tombstone. And I knew it wasn't to have launched digital TV in Switzerland. And through this idea, I defined 2 areas or 3 areas where I would feel that the purpose was right for me. One area was education, one area was pharma, and one area was energy. Energy, I was part then of a team at the World Economic Forum that was called the Young Global Leaders, and I was very involved in renewable energies. And then this friend also helped me and got me a job in an energy company, so in a power company. And that was just 3 months before Fukushima that I started in an energy company as part of the executive board, and I was responsible for all the power systems. We had our own power plants, we had the hydro plants, we had wind parks, we also had some shares in nuclear power plants. And then 2011, Fukushima happened. And I was in the job for 3 months. And so I had to get back and explain all my people. I had a team of about 150 people, what was happening there. And I had no clue.
That's right. But to be honest, at that point, nobody knew that it wasn't necessarily the plant. It was where it was sited, right?
Yeah, totally. But I learned a lot in a very short time. 3 years into the job, my boss left and became CEO of Axpo. And then so he asked me what I would become CEO of this CKW and be part of the executive board. I changed over to that. It was a publicly traded company, which was interesting. I had about 2,000 people working for me in all areas, and I could really work on the topics that I was interested in. So renewable energy, large investments into wind, into PV, also into photovoltaics, but also build out of an energy infrastructure, also using decentral forms with electric cars, which is a sort of a new form of a long-term storage. And if you kind of couple them,
two ways.
as long as it goes two ways, what you would call vehicle to grid. Yes, correct.
Yep.
Which is still not fully functional. But those were my plans, and I really loved it. And think about it, I changed over from music to physics, and then into consulting, and then into telecom, then into media, and then into energy. And those were totally different sectors. So every single time you need to build up your new network, your new people, your new environment. So that was on one side very exciting. On the other side, actually also quite demanding in terms of energy level.
Time, energy.
So I probably wasn't the best father in many ways. I didn't spend so much time with my kids as looking back I should have. But yeah, that's one of the learnings also from those years.
Did your time at the ETH and your studies there, how did that prepare you for that path?
So it prepared me for a lot of Brazilians. If you do basic science, it's really a challenge. You never know whether somebody is publishing the stuff that you're working on next day and you're starting from scratch. I also started from scratch a couple of times because the area that I worked in didn't turn out to be interesting enough. So I had to restart. And one of my professors was a Nobel laureate, so his perspective on how that should be was quite elevated. And so
you learned how to learn.
I learned how to learn. I learned how to be curious about certain things. And I learned how to surround myself with smart people.
And how does one surround oneself with smart people?
In leadership, you usually say A people hire A people and B people hire C people. First off, I think if you believe that you're the smartest guy in the room, you will not surround yourself with smart people.
That's a great expression.
And the second thing is if you're sharing and if you're open and if you want to contribute to something bigger and you find a common purpose, then you find people that share that passion, that vision. And that's what makes you move. And I learned that also in part there, but I think I continued to learn that in all my jobs that I was going through in all those years.
Very cool. So there's a final step in what you're doing, which is how you go from working in topics like renewable energy and vehicle to grid to the NZZ, NZZ as we call it. So maybe just how did that happen? Okay. Was this another bike ride or go another try with your kids? Or
actually, I was in France. It was summer. We were at the beach, and I got a call from Egon Zehnder, which is one of those headhunting companies. And I picked up the phone. I was on the beach, and I was actually thinking that they usually asked me for a reference or so on. So I picked up, and the guy tells me, "Listen, I have this very cool job. That might be something for you." And I said, "What is it?" And so he says, CEO of NZZ. And I go, and I tell him, but you're totally crazy. You're totally nuts. I've been working for the last 7 years in energy. I'm totally gone. And I looked at the numbers and the company is small. The revenues are small. The profit is very small. I was in a bigger job in terms of numbers, but the brand is huge. So it's a kind of a European New York Times. And then I talked to my family, I talked to my kids, and then my daughter told me or asked me, but don't they have anybody better than you?
That's a vote of confidence.
Which is actually the line I started with meeting the chairman. Because that was really also the question I asked myself, but I wasn't as clear as she was. That's the lovely thing about kids. So she was very clear about that. And,
they have no hesitation to speak truth to parents.
No.
Can you just give some basic facts about what the NZZ is? Because many of our listeners may not be at all familiar.
The most similar model is the New York Times. We're really a quality newspaper that has been publishing for many years. We have a huge team of our own editorial staff with really high caliber people working in all areas from sports to macro to micro to European law to international politics to feuilleton, which is culture. So it's really, it's a typical newspaper, so to say, that has gone very digital in the last years.
And how long have you been at the NZZ?
So it's been now roughly 5 years. We have achieved in the last years, we never had more subscribers than we have now. We're more profitable than 10 years ago. We're growing on top line, so we're growing in net revenues. The thing I'm most proud of is that we introduced a change of culture in the way we interact. We also don't perceive, when I joined, my feeling was there was this huge brand. The company was actually small, so think about 700, 800 people. But the brand is so huge that you believe, we're big. So you behave like you're big, but then you also build up cost structures that are big. But that doesn't work. So we became much more agile. We became much faster. We became much more customer-centric, much more open feedback type of people. Also much more international. Before I joined, I think there wasn't anybody in the company that didn't speak German. By now, we have tons of people that only speak English.
So with the NZZ, what do you see as the key challenges going forward? Just before we go back to some of the other questions. Certainly the world of media continues to evolve at a ridiculous pace.
I mean, media was the first one to be hit by the internet. And so media will be the first one to be hit by Gen AI. So these transformations, since media is quite asset light, it's very personnel driven, is being hit by these models very substantially. So I think it would be totally wrong to think that we're done now. The transformation and changes will continue. I firmly believe that quality journalism, on which political stand actually doesn't really matter, but quality journalism where people really think through and try to describe the world and give orientation to its readers, viewers, or whatever it is, has never been more important than in these years. Because we see so much fake content coming up that I love the quote or the slogan of the Washington Post that goes, "That democracy dies in darkness." And so I think it's our duty to bring light to maintain democracy.
So I'm going to ask a few final questions.
Sure.
What is your favorite place to go in Zurich or at the ETH?
I sit here at the lake of Zurich, and probably in the nicest office of Zurich, viewing the Opera House and the lake. Probably my preferred spot is I started to row 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and starting at ETH. And to be on the lake in the morning at 6 o'clock when the sun is rising and the lake is really flat, and to be rowing with a friend is probably as good as it gets.
All right. That's a lovely image. And what are you reading now? What's either on your bedside table or listening to as a podcast? What are you curious about?
Okay, let me start by that. I'm the guy that reads 15 books in parallel. And at the same time, I watch tons of things. And so I do everything in parallel. Picking out 2 or 3 books that I'm currently reading. I'm reading Gary Kasparov's book on artificial intelligence. That's one of the books I'm reading. I'm listening to a lot of podcasts by Gary Marcus or the founders of ChatGPT. I'm really busy with that topic right now. I decided that I needed to read the newest. We just had a big interview with John Irving. I'm a big John Irving fan. Another podcast that is, of course, lovely to listen to is ETH Accent. I didn't mention it, but it's our daily podcast. But I personally love it.
Fantastic. Hey, Felix, thank you so much. That was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Susan, thank you.
I'm Susan Kish, host of the We Are ETH series, telling the story of the alumni and friends of the ETH Zurich, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. ETH regularly ranks amongst the top universities in the world with cutting-edge research, science, and people. The people who were there, the people who are there, and the people who will be there. Please subscribe to this podcast and join us wherever you listen, and give us a good rating on Spotify or Apple if you enjoyed today's conversation. I'd like to thank our producers at ETH Circle and Ellie Media, and especially to thank you, our listeners, for joining us.